When a Viking died, how they're buried differs greatly from what we see today. This is because the Vikings had various beliefs that influenced even this aspect of their lives in unique ways. Luckily, some of these burial and funeral traditions have not only provided real evidence that these seafaring warriors existed, but they have also helped us learn about them in far more ways than we could have imagined. To begin exploring these traditions, we must understand that the death of a Norseman was a serious event, unless the person was a slave or a mere commoner. It carried even more meaning if the person in question was a warrior or a high-ranking Viking. As such, the Vikings created these traditions to honor and mourn their dead, whom they believed would continue living in the afterlife. The most common of these traditions was cremation. This process involved burning the body entirely, turning flesh and bone into ash. To achieve the intense heat necessary, they constructed pyres, large stacks of flammable materials like tree trunks and branches. Vikings believed cremation not only released the deceased soul for the afterlife, but also served as a purification ritual, warding off any evil spirits clinging to the body. If the cremation process was performed on land, the ashes were either scattered, kept in an urn, or buried. However, there were times when the cremation was not done on land. Instead, the body and the funeral pyre were placed on a Viking ship and set to sail. A Viking would then light an arrow and fire it into the ship, igniting the pyre and setting the vessel ablaze. In the end, the ashes and remains eventually sank to the bottom of the sea. Later, as Christianity became more common among the Vikings, cremation was abandoned, while inhumation was more widely adopted. In this case, the earth was dug and the bodies were laid directly into the ground or in coffins of various kinds, such as ships, boats, wagons, chests, or chambers. Slaves were mostly buried directly in the ground, just the way they died, with no special covering. This method was also used for mere commoners, although in some cases they were wrapped up before being buried or buried in a small boat. Higher status Vikings used chests or chambers which were more elaborately made and took more time to construct than it took to make the boats. Meanwhile, ships were reserved for the most noble Vikings and the very wealthy. Whether in the case of inhumation or the previous discussed cremation, these ships would have taken months to construct, which is enough evidence to prove that only such individuals could have commissioned them. While cremation burials have left little or no evidence for experts to analyze, inhumation has provided a wealth of material to explore. The reason is that Vikings constructed recognizable mounds over the burial sites of their deceased loved ones, scattering throughout Scandinavia and beyond. Some of these mounds were truly monumental, like those at Bure, Norway, reaching impressive heights of 6 meters and a diameter of 45 meters. Jelling, Denmark, boasted an even larger mound, reaching nearly 10 meters tall and 70 meters wide. Other notable ones include those at Birka, Sweden, used to conceal chamber graves, and others at Oseberg, Gokstad, both in Norway, and Ladby, Denmark, which were used for ship burials. Despite these impressive mounds, the vast majority discovered were far more diminutive and have reduced dramatically in height over time due to natural effects such as rain and erosion. For many under this category, they are barely noticeable in the landscape except by aerial photography. However, one thing is for sure: just as there were a variety of inhumation styles depending on the power and status of the person buried, the size of a mound also reflected this. Regardless of the funeral style chosen, the Vikings often performed various rituals to honor their dead. The body's nails were trimmed and new clothes were worn on it to give it a cleaner look. They also offered prayers to their gods to usher the deceased into the afterlife and poured libations onto the grave or pyre to honor the person's spirit, just before the inhumation or cremation act was carried out. These rituals could sometimes take on a gory and weird form. Is the account of the Middle Ages traveler Ahmad ibn Fadlan, who described the funeral of a Viking chieftain. According to Fadlan, the Viking chief was cremated along with a sacrificial female slave. The slave was forced to drink large amounts of alcohol and then sleep with multiple men in the village as a tribute to the deceased. She was subsequently strangled with a rope and stabbed by the village matriarch before being set ablaze with her master. It was also common for the Vikings to bury their dead with some of their goods or belongings. They practiced this act because they believed the grave goods would be put to use in the afterlife. This also meant that the grave goods had to undergo the same burial methods as the body. So if the body was to be cremated, the grave goods were most likely placed on the same pyre as the body and burnt together. However, if the body was to be buried, the grave goods would also be buried with them, regardless of whether they used an empty grave, boat coffin, chamber, or a ship. The grave goods varied in type and quantity. For instance, a warrior was typically buried with weapons and riding equipment, while an artisan, such as a blacksmith, might be interred with his complete set of tools. Women were often buried with their jewelry and tools for household activities. High-ranking individuals frequently had animals and sometimes slaves killed and buried alongside them, in addition to their personal belongings. In terms of quantity, the higher the status of the individual, the more extensive their grave goods. A prime example is the Oseberg ship burial, believed to be for a woman, possibly a queen or a priestess from the 9th century. Archaeologists excavating in 1904 discovered a wide array of items, ranging from exquisite to unusual. These included clothes, shoes, combs, various farm and kitchen tools, a wooden cart, 3 ornate sleighs, 1 working sleigh, several chests, 5 carved wooden animal heads, 2 cows, 15 horses, and 6 dogs. The Gokstad ship, discovered in 1879, also contained similar animal remains, including 12 horses, 8 dogs, 2 goshawks, 2 peacocks, and single bones from a duck and a sheep. However, the absence of personal jewelry and weaponry in the burial mound led to the conclusion that the grave had likely been raided before its discovery. Perhaps the most interesting of the burial and funeral traditions of the Vikings is their concept of the afterlife. Just as they believed that multiple gods existed, they also believed that there were a variety of afterlife destinations depending on how and where the person died. Glorious warriors who fell in battle or during raids journeyed to Valhalla, Odin's magnificent hall. There they would join the Einherjar, an elite band of warriors who feasted and trained for Ragnarok, the final battle. Freya, another powerful deity, also claimed fallen heroes, but with a more selective approach. Her realm, Folkvangar, housed worthy warriors known for their honor and courage, who were seen as less bloodthirsty than those chosen for Valhalla. Yet another option, called Gimli, existed, but was reserved for the most virtuous of all the dead warriors. For sailors who died at sea, their afterlife was with Ran, the sea goddess. Ran was believed to have used fishing nets to catch these dead sailors and bring them into her realm. She was married to Aegir, the ruler of the ocean and its depths, and together they hosted these dead sailors at grand feasts in their underwater hall. Other desirable afterlife destinations included Breime, filled with never-ending wine and food, and Sindri, which housed those who were educated and good during their lives. Undesirable afterlife destinations like Niflheim also existed. This place is known primarily as a realm of primordial ice and cold. Many Vikings believed that within Niflheim was Hel, an abode ruled by Hel, the goddess daughter of Loki, where those who did not die a heroic or noble death were sent. They also believed that within the realm there was a huge and terrible hall with its doors facing north, towards the icy winds and
Monsieur, решили жить опасной жизнью. Такой уж у нас уклад.
Said to be condemned to wade through these
Кто
rivers,
этот коллега?
while braided snakes attached to the roof of the hall continuously
Кто
spewed
это,
venom
что
at
есть
them.
в твоей голове? Это дар.
However, this wasn't the worst fate.
Ты размышляешь не так, как другие. Ты непредсказуемый.
Of Kvergr, where the dragon-like serpent Nidhogg resided. The serpent was believed to nourish itself on the bodies of those condemned to this location for the rest of eternity.